We shall now begin session one on aligning long-term energy scenarios, LTES, with long-term low emission development strategies, LTLES, to strengthen climate action. This session shall be moderated by Simo Benmaraz, Analyst, Technology and Infrastructure at IRENA. Welcome, Simo.
Thank you very much, Angela, and a very good morning to everyone here. Yes, I'm unmute. Okay, so a very good morning to everyone. I'm very happy to be here today to join the discussion, very important discussion on the alignments of long-term energy scenarios and one of the key building blocks of the Paris Agreement, the so-called long-term low emission development strategies. Coming back from COP27, we've seen a lot of very, very important discussion around the need to increase ambition in basically the announcement for countries. We have seen, of course, that the discussion at COP were heavily focused on the breakthrough of setting a new fund for loss and damages. But of course, we've seen a lot of traction in increasing the focus on what country needs to deliver more ambition on the LTLEDs. So one of the key, and my colleagues mentioned, is that we've seen a need to strengthen the way they are developed, because compared to the nationally determined contribution, which some of those have a framework and country can use existing form to submit them. LTLEs today have no really strong guidance on how to develop them. And of course, it highlights the need for more coordination between the bodies in charge of developing the national planning capacities for energy and the stakeholders in charge of developing the LTLEDs, which are economy-wide and include more than energy. So very importantly, of course, and also the good news is that there is in the cover text of COP27 language around urging parties to submit new LTLEDs for COP28. Of course, as well, asking UNFCCC to submit a new LTLED report for COP28, and as well in the energy transition part, of course, we've seen more reference mixing renewable energy and long-term low emission development strategies. So today, the main elements we want to discuss is the need for coordination between parties which are in charge of LTES and LTLEDs, the added value or the benefits of including scenario-driven analysis for LTLEDs, and of course the need for stakeholder engagement across all governments to develop a credible one. And of course, from the discussion as well, this needs to be useful for countries to access more opportunity to include renewable in their plans. And of course, the topic of just transition and access to finance also needs to be included there. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by a fantastic panel. We'll have a series of presentation and a discussion. At the end of those round, we'll have a Q&A session, both online and with you. We encourage really for you to ask questions and clarify any elements you see, because very importantly, we want to take stock of what are the discussion and disseminate this further. I would like now to invite the panelists to the table. I will invite Mr. Kenichi Kitamura, Associate Program Officer, NDC LTLEDs and Sector Unit at the UNFCCC. Welcome. Ms. Ploypalin Sundara Jumpaka, Country Engagement Specialist at the NDC Partnership. I hope I did not, yes, please, you can join your name. We'll have as well my colleague Nadim Goussous from the Clean Energy Transition Scenario team. And we'll have Henry Weissman joining us online, the coordinator of Deep Decarbonization Pathway Project at IDRI. And we'll have as well Malin Hofgaard-Vested, advisor for the Center for System Analysis at the Danish Energy Agency, and Mr. Paul Dean, Senior Research Fellow at the Environmental Research Institute, Marais, Center at the University of Cork. We would like to start with the presentation from Mr. Kitamura. He will provide us an overview of the LTES synthesis report that was published just before COP27, and we'll have Ms. Ploy-Palin Sundara Jumpaka also as a discussant. Just to start the discussion and really align on what are the key elements maybe for the discussion, I think one of the first important elements we would like to identify is what are the efforts being made to align the national planning activities, so the LTES, with the global net zero targets or the low emission target for many countries, and what are the main challenges in doing so. The second aspect, very importantly, are the benefits of using scenario-based LTES, so integrating, as my colleague Juan Josegas here, the modeling tools at hand. Also to understand, maybe taking stock, but also to understand what is the requirement for coordination between LTES and LTLEDs, and how, as an international community, how can we facilitate across all government coordination for this development. And of course, this will be really important to understand the key challenging of integrating LTES in the development of LTNets. Mr. Kitamura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simon. You set the scene very well. That makes my life easier. Hello, everyone. My name is Kenichi. This slide has the different name, Bernd. He's unfortunately not able to join today because of sickness, but we are working the same team. And we are really glad to be here because as a Secretariat of UN Climate Change, we are calling for limiting temperature increase to below 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, but we cannot achieve such a climate goal without energy transitions. And many countries have started to develop on long-term climate strategies only a couple of years ago after the adoption of Paris Agreement. But energy scenarios and energy modeling community has more rich histories. So we are very much interested in how long-term energy scenarios can help develop robust national long-term climate strategies, as well as how climate change consideration is affecting the development of long-term energy scenarios and the key issues and challenges and what would be the next steps. And today I would like to share with you some findings from our census report on long-term climate strategies. And before touching upon the findings, can you help me move to the next slide? I would like to mention some outcome of the COP27 we just had last month. Yeah. So for the first time in the history of UNFCCC over the last 2 decades, in the main decision of the COP, there is a section on energy. And in the under the mitigation section, this is the reaffirmation of the text from the last year in Glasgow. But this, the fact that these energy focused language is included in the main COP decision highlights the shift at the political level from negotiation of international framework on climate change to promoting concrete action to achieve the long-term climate goals. And I'm sure the focus of energy will be increasing over the next years as we step into more on the concrete climate actions. And these underlines I put for your ease of readiness, so the original text doesn't have underline. So what is the long-term low emission development strategies? it's written in the Paris Agreement, but it's not obligation. It's not mandatory strategies. So it's up to the governments to submit or develop long-term strategies. And last year and this year, there is one key shift and keyword on the long-term strategy, which is the just transition to net zero emissions by or around mid-century. Mid-century means 2050 or 2060. And we published the first census report on the long-term strategies in October, based on the strategy submitted as 23rd of September. In total, 53 long-term climate strategies representing 62 parties. The difference is the EU member states. Those strategies account for 70% of the global greenhouse gas emissions and 80% of GDP and 70% of total energy consumption. And more countries have submitted long-term climate strategies after this deadline, including India, Tunisia, Zimbabwe, or Argentina. So let me move to some findings in our census report. So one finding is that when it comes to long-term mitigation goal, 62% specified net zero greenhouse gas emissions goal by mid-century, and 6% net zero CO2 emissions, and 50% has net zero emissions goal, but without deliberating the coverage of greenhouse gas. And 20% didn't contain a goal related to net zero emissions. And what is the benefit of using scenario-based long-term climate strategies? Governments didn't always specify the benefit, but we can infer the fact that 72% of long-term climate strategies show the emission scenarios and projections, and 8% indicated they didn't include the scenario, but they will develop scenario as a follow-up of long-term climate strategies. And 60% of long-term climate strategies shows multiple scenarios for considering different pathway to technology developments such as hydrogen and carbon capture and bioenergies, and interdependency among the sectors, such as the share of renewable energy in electricity production and electrification of transport, building, and other end-use sectors. The third point is 53% of long-term climate strategy reported a scenario based on business as usual or with existing measures to identify what is necessary to achieve their long-term mitigation goal in terms of additional policy interventions. Going to more details about the scenarios included in long-term climate strategies. So 50% of long-term climate strategies described sector-level projections or scenarios. And all of these 50% of long-term climate strategies mentioned energy elements. If you look at the right-hand side of the figure, the energy seems to be less frequently mentioned than the agriculture, but this is not the case because the different long-term climate strategies describe the energy sector a different way, such as transport, energy supply, or buildings, or energy sector as a whole. The number seems to be less frequently than agriculture, but in fact, all of the sector level projections touch upon the energy aspect. And in addition to that, at the bottom three bar of this figure tells that in total, 28% of long-term climate strategies included projection with a focus on energy, such as electricity generation, installed capacity by source, total energy consumption by source and by sectors, and total primary energy supply by source. And in addition to the sector level projections and the scenarios, there are common midterm indicative targets for achieving the long-term climate strategies. These are mainly related to the energy. Just give you the example, when country aims to achieve 100% clean electricity generation, 100% electrified vehicle share in new passenger car sales, phasing out fossil fuel passenger vehicle sales, requiring new buildings to be net zero and near zero energy level, and phasing out unabated coal power. And lastly, in relation to the topics of this forum, what levels of coordination are required to efficiently link long-term energy scenarios with long-term climate strategies? First of all, 84% of long-term climate strategies emphasize that institutional arrangements are a critical component for planning and coordination. And they also specify some institutional arrangements for coordination. First, 57% of the strategies mentioned high-level governance setting, including under the authority of the Prime Minister or presidential committees, as well as within the framework of an ad hoc interministerial body with a coordination function. And 30% mentions thematic working groups for sectoral experts and the stakeholders to exchange views and information. The energy is often found in these thematic working groups. And 29% climate strategy described mandates, function, the objectives of consultative and advisory bodies composed of independent experts. Their function is to generate climate-related knowledge or help governments being accountable to publishing the reports on progress and information on best available science. And lastly, the 38% of long-term climate strategies indicated that their long-term mitigation goal is formalized under national legislation, which help ensure the coordination among the different government agencies. So these are some findings from the long-term climate strategies, and there are more information available on our website, and please feel free to send us any email if you have any question. And it takes so much time to read all long-term climate strategies, but you can just ask us any specific question, then we are happy to answer any question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kenichi. I think the SINS report is a treasure of information. People working on supporting countries on LTES find this report immensely useful. So thank you very much for your work and your team's work in supporting this endeavor. Ms. Propanin, you are part of the NDC partnership. You recently launched a very interesting call on LTES, and what are your views on these aspects of aligning LTES and LTES, and of course the need for the use of scenarios?
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you for the presentation. And I think what we can see from the presentation is that countries are focusing on long-term energy and also long-term low-emission strategies. And 53 countries have submitted, which means there's much more countries that still need to be submitted. In terms of what we've heard, we can, I think, all agree that energy is cross-cutting. We'll see that in all sectors. And at the partnership, we are a coalition of 200 members, developing and developed countries, and also institutions such as IRENA, and the UNFCCC is also hosting us. What this means is that we are working together to find a way how to best support countries to align not only the LTES, but also the NDC, because we focus on the NDC, but in general, this will have the energy component nonetheless. So in doing so, I'll focus a little bit on the thematic call, what you have mentioned. The thematic call is a call that will focus countries' requests. So we work with countries to develop requests to identify where needs are in terms of their climate needs in the next year from 2022 to 2025, and support countries to identify and develop their vision, their long-term vision, but also update the NDC in the meantime. The entire purpose is that we start early, that we start to already look at how to use existing targets that we have in the NDC and to push that forward to 2020 2050 goals. Um, I think the key component here is having the, sorry, let me restart. So in terms of the alignment of the support, what we're doing is that we are supporting countries to prepare the support, but also to develop the LT-LEDs as well, and also to find transformative policies in terms of the. But I want to also reflect on your presentation, which is that we see that there is existing data, existing systems, and the question I think we have to find is how do we use this more broadly and across the different sectors. In terms of what the partnership is doing is that we try to match what match the technical assistant or match the support that we have to the country. And we try to do that at speed and at scale. And with this support, we have, Denmark is also on board, Germany is also on board with the partnership to move together globally to support the countries to create the vision and create the vision in a way that incorporates all the sectors. So I think in terms of the energy scenario, what is important is that it gives a strong basis with the data, a strong basis for countries to make these decisions. And it also, I think, helps not inspire, but also motivate other sectors to think similarly in using strong scientific data to make these decisions, and how we can use the same set of data so that there is not a mismatch between between the different sectors, and then that creates the kind of national picture for everyone, for the country. So I think that would be how I would say there is that component of alignment there that we see. But I think most important is how to align this and also how to have the conversation cross sector. I think this is the key point of how we move ahead, is this moving as a unit whilst using existing data that or existing work that we've done, so we don't grow.
Thank you so much. And also, I wish to commend the work of the partnership, of course, expanding from the early on the climate action enhancement package, but now also supporting countries in, as you mentioned, expanding the number of countries that will submit in the future LTLEDs. Thank you very much. I'd like to now introduce my very dear colleague, Nadim Goussous, Associate Program Officer, Clean Energy Transition Scenarios at IRENA. He will present us the latest insights of the analysis on our work on the alignment of LTES and LTLEDs. Nadim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simon. Just a second while I load up the presentation.
Just while Nadim load this presentation, online we got a comment that if you can please also for the Q&A later, speak as close as you can to your microphone, because it will be easier for people to hear online. Thank you.
So, hi everyone, and thank you again all for joining us today for the forum. Very happy to see you here. My name is Nadim Goussous. I'm an Associate Program Officer in the LTES team within the Energy Planning team at IRENA. And I'm here to present today our upcoming publication coming up next month on long-term energy scenarios, low emission development strategies in their stock taking and alignment. So this publication is coming up next month. I'm very happy to present actually after Kenichi. Um, so I'm very happy to present after Kenichi. This report came out after discussions with the UNFCCC on how the alignment is looking between the energy world and the climate uh, strategies and the wider scope, let's say, within development here. So yes, I'm very happy to present after him. I think we'll have some similar graphs, but that should be fine. That's a good sign, I think. And yes, so let's begin. So just a bit of introduction about the objective and the scope of this study. So here we're looking at LTES, long-term energy scenarios, and the documents within them. Juan Jose has already spoken to you about that, but just briefly, here we're looking at scenarios that have generally the objective of ensuring a secure, affordable, and sustainable energy supply. Scope is usually the energy or power sector, and it's usually between 50 to 30 years time horizon. And I won't go too deep into LTLEDs either. We just had a whole presentation about it as well. So, but here we're looking at mid-century goals for a just transition to global net zero emissions, where the scope is the whole economy until 2050 or later, which is, for example, 2060. We've shown here some examples of the LTS documents that we're talking about, some examples from Brazil, Nigeria, Philippines, and Canada. So as I said, 15, 20, 30 years of time horizon, and also here an important distinction is they are produced or commissioned by governments. So this is, let's say, the important distinction here on what an LTS is. And we'll continue to use LTS referring to the scenarios passed within those planning documents. The objective of this report was to develop a comparative analysis of the institutional process that goes behind, and the institutional and governance process that goes behind developing LTLEDs as well as LTS, and as well as the technical coverage of the scenarios. So this is the coverage of the energy transition elements, which I'll show in a bit. We've looked here at 60 scenario-based documents. This includes 36 LTLEDs and 25 LTS. The numbers don't add up. We can have one that we can kind of consider as both from the UK, the net zero strategy. And the idea here was to help complement the synthesis report from the UNFCCC and see how the energy world, let's say, is aligned with the LTLEDs and vice versa. So I'll be presenting some of the main findings from here. There's quite a bit of information. We've done this through extensive surveys that were completed by the countries. So thank you very much for also the representatives that have completed these surveys. Where we couldn't complete the surveys, we also had extensive desk research that's been also validated. So yeah, so this has been the work that's been done over the past year, and we look into two main elements. First, I will talk about the institutional side of things. So here we have institutional and governance frameworks behind producing these LTS and LTLEDs. We're looking here at characteristics such as, for example, who the publishing institutions are, or stakeholder consultation and the modeling tools, for example, used. We also have a lot of other characteristics. We look into how many scenarios were used, the objective of the scenarios as well, and so the number of scenarios and the most ambitious ones, for example. But I'll just give a few comments here, and hopefully you'll see the rest of the results in the publication. We look into, for example, the publishing institutions. Most of the LTS publishing institutions are usually ministries of energy or specialized planning institutions, while for LTLEDs, it's usually Ministry of Climate or Environment, or a interdisciplinary ministry or a super ministry, let's say, which has portfolio of different sectors. And I think this comes. This is an interesting finding later on to see how they how this affects the alignment of these scenarios. Also, we looked into the stakeholder consultation. Most LTES, I think this also agrees with the findings from UNFCCC, but most of the LTES have held consultations to develop their scenarios. And most of LTES as well have as well, even though to a lesser extent, have either told us basically that they have done consultation or mentioned it in their documents. We also looked briefly at the modeling tools. LEAP and TIMES are very commonly used. So 44% of LTS and 27% of LTLEDs use either of those. And a lot of countries also naturally use integrated models where they integrate different subsectors and they collaborate with different external stakeholders to focus on these different subsectors. And moving to the technical results. I think there's a lot more to discuss in the institution, but I think it's important to also put it into context later. So here, this graph you can see here comes out a result out of after discussions and findings from other IRENA reports. So here we have the World Energy Transitions Outlook, and then it was further developed in the Smart Electrification report by IRENA that was published last year. And we've managed to dig deeper into these different subsectors, let's say or building blocks within this framework to let's say to highlight the 62 different elements of the energy transition. So here we're looking at things from energy supply to infrastructure, transmission and distribution. We have storage, end-use sectors, resource availability and bottlenecks, non-electrification pathways, let's say, such as direct use of renewable energy heat and bioenergy, and energy efficiency, other mitigation measures and carbon dioxide removal, for example, and contextual block, let's say, which talks more about the policy targets and socioeconomic assessment that can be found within scenarios. So this includes access, job impacts, behavioral change, and health. So overall, we've looked into all of these different things in terms of how they're assessed, or if they're assessed and how they're assessed. So here we're looking into, we did a comparison of LTLEDs and LTS for each element. And we have, for example, we can show that an element was quantitatively assessed within a scenario versus qualitatively, for example, just in the narrative of the scenario rather than, say, numerically assessed there. And you can see this is an example of one of the highlights showing how, for example, solar renewables, and namely solar PV, onshore wind, are always shown in LTS, while it's slightly less represented, for example, in LTLEDs. But some of the, let's say, also more interesting, I think, aspects that can be seen and that we found is we found a general underrepresentation of hydrogen and e-fuel production, and especially the infrastructure needs for hydrogen within scenarios. And this goes for both. So production is shown, but the infrastructure needs are not necessarily assessed. And we think a more extensive assessment of these, well, it's still, let's say, a more recent problem due to the technology and the research in this matter. A more extensive assessment can be helpful to lead to insights about the, let's say, what the crucial infrastructure is, what type of investment is needed as well for the energy transition. So in order to kind of avoid underestimating the needs for this infrastructure. But one interesting thing, and I'll come back to it in a bit, is how you can see a slight tendency for LTLEDs to represent technologies such as hydrogen or other technologies as well that I'll show in a second, more than LTS. So that's probably owing to their longer time horizon and focus on reaching net zero, which is not necessarily always the case for LTS. So here, this is a general one. This is kind of an aggregated one. So as we're looking at the graph, it's not necessarily representing if power production is shown, but out of the elements we've looked into, how many of them are assessed in the scenario. So power production is highlighted in all of the scenarios we looked at, but this is just generally a look at how many elements have they represented. And one thing that LTS generally does better in, or let's say is more comprehensive in across the board, is the representation of generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure. This is also, and it's also better at representing storage solutions and more recent storage solutions here, thermal energy storage, for example, as one, and also slightly better at showing some of the constraints like water availability and land use. However, there's room for improvement in that aspect, actually on both. But on the other hand, and maybe we can see that actually in the previous slide, one thing that goes the other way around is how energy efficiency and conservation, circular economy, for example, as well, is highlighted more in LTLEDs. This is both quantitatively and also in the text itself. This is, I think this was one of the outcomes as well in the UNFCCC report, but there is a big focus on circular economy, for example, there. And another one is the mitigation measures we mentioned, such as carbon dioxide removal, CCUS, and yes, so mainly those. So there's generally a lot of representation for those, and as I mentioned, this is can owe to that they are nearly all going to net zero and to their longer time horizon, which allows it to look more at future development of these technologies. And another important one, and it is quite overlooked, I think, in both types of scenarios. So LTLEDs tend to show socioeconomic factors more. Let's say we're talking here about the benefits of the energy transition, the health impacts and the job impacts. They are nearly always shown in the LTLEDs themselves, in the text itself, for example, but not necessarily always in the scenarios. However, they are still represented more within the scenarios in LTLEDs. And this is something that can be very useful for LTS, let's say, to learn from, because it can communicate as well better some of the important and very beneficial, let's say, effects of the energy transition. So yes. So as I mentioned, we have about 62 different elements here. There's some interesting insights. Won't go into it all, but next month, hopefully, we'll have the publication within your hands, and we can have further discussions about it. One quick exercise we did as well here, as I mentioned, there's the institutional side of it that we looked into, and we wanted to see if we can gather some type of insight on whether the alignment through, for example, interdisciplinary ministries or interdisciplinary ministries or ministries publishing together, how that can help better align those scenarios and improve the representation of some critical elements of the scenarios. So as I mentioned, LTS tend to almost always show power generation, transmission and distribution for power better. However, we looked into 11 different examples of countries which have produced both LTS and LTLEDs, looking both into their alignment or institutional structure behind developing those scenarios, and also how comprehensively they represent them. And we find, for example, that the LTLEDs that are produced by interdisciplinary, let's say, publishing institutions, where there's a portfolio of energy and climate there, tend to do quite well, as good as the LTS, let's say, or even sometimes even represent more elements of the power generation and infrastructure requirements than ones that are produced by, let's say, in more of a silo or in specific ministries that don't necessarily have much of an alignment with the energy sector and beyond.
So while this is a small sample, and of course it requires, I think, more exploration, more looking into different types of setups as well, and a more qualitative look at the setups, it can be an interesting way to start the discussion about how important some of the um, alignment methods and different setups can be. So we have some brief conclusions from this as well that we've seen. And LTLEDs definitely present a very, very good opportunity for the energy, climate, policy making, but also beyond. So in development and transport infrastructure, there's a lot of room here to come closer and communicate mutual objectives and targets. So can be very beneficial for sending important signals to policy, but also investors, technology developers, and also international cooperation. But the good news is we've seen generally a good level of alignment between the scenarios within them, indicating a good level as well of alignment between production of those different types of plans and strategies. And one conclusion we can draw out of this is a scenario-based planning and wider adoption of scenario-based planning can be very beneficial to produce something more robust. Because naturally or a lot of times from let's say, the scenario development process, it can lead to more stakeholder engagement, some more data-based, let's say, dialogue between the different stakeholders, and can hopefully result as well in greater buy-in from sectors beyond just energy and climate as well. Some of the common observations we noticed with the LTLEDs synthesis reports, the crucial need for renewables, electrification, and energy efficiency to reach net zero. But, and as I mentioned, we saw that socioeconomic impacts and elements are still not represented to the level that they should be. There's always the caveat here that there's a trade-off, of course, between the complexity of the model, for example, the model and scenario, and what you can actually represent. However, and this is taken into account, but however, I think socioeconomic elements representing them in scenarios can provide a very good opportunity to communicate the actual good benefits of the energy transition to the different stakeholders, to policymakers, but also to wider communities. So in the end, yes, one important aspect we also always want to stress, and I think Kenichi also stressed this in his presentation before, is the importance of aligned processes and how these aligned processes can provide those trustworthy scenarios that can send the right messages. So we've developed some, let's say, recommendations might be a strong word. It's a kind of an observation coming out of this on how to best develop some of the scenarios within LTLEDs. So ensuring coordination between the different institutions, not only energy and climate, but beyond. You can take advantage of the very broad expertise of those different institutions, and it can be very beneficial for those scenarios. Engaging a broad range of stakeholders to develop these scenarios. And the scenarios themselves should be developed in a way that goes beyond, let's say, traditional energy scenarios that have been produced, let's say, similarly, maybe since the 70s, but also including elements that are usually left out and really trying to go beyond there. And then after that, you need to communicate it. So I think the strong communication and outreach strategy, because this can also lead to the next step here, which is implementation, which is actually what you eventually want this LTLEDs to provide. You want implementation and strongly communicating this, and then capitalizing on the visibility of these documents, of LTLEDs on the international scale, on the national scale, can be a very good driver for policymaking, for hopefully also putting it into law as well, and making it a strong driver for the changes, let's say, radical transformations that we want to see. So this just about concludes my presentation. I'd just like to mention that the data will be published as well on a dashboard and accompanying the report. We already have a simple dashboard, let's say a beta version of the dashboard that has some brief information about a limited amount of countries. However, the idea here is to publish all this data that we have within this dashboard and really try to build a platform for countries to both share and learn as well from what others are doing in a in-depth way. And this will be focused on countries, on what governments are doing. So this can bring something kind of new to this landscape, hopefully. And yes, with this, I would like to thank you all for listening. Thank you very much. And yeah, and see you around as well in the forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadim, for a very exciting insight and also a recommendation for countries to develop integrate LTES in LTLEDs. We have an online discussant, Henry from IDRI in France. Henry, you witness the latest developments in terms of, like, say, supporting countries in those developments. Can you give us a few insights from your work, of course, with the project, but also in general, what are the best practices we have today to this endeavor? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you just confirm you hear me well?
Henry, we cannot hear you. Hold on a moment.
Can you hear me?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
I do hear you.
Just hold on a moment. We'll get you to the sound ready. So Henry is unmuted, so it means it should be on our sides. Yes, Henry, can you try again?
Yes, you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Perfect.
Please, you have the floor.
The most difficult part is done. Thanks a lot. And sorry for not being able to attend in person, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to react. As mentioned, in the Deep Decarbonization Pathway Initiative we are running at IDRI, we belong to the community working on the LTES in the UNFCCC context. And I'd like just to thank a lot Irina and the UNFCCC to just put this topic on the table and to highlight the need to connect the dots between exercises that are being done at the country level. We see in many countries that there are lots of exercises being done, and probably we can expect that this will happen more and more in the future, that touch to topics that are similar or connected, but not exactly same processes. And in the absence of good coordination, this may create a lot of misunderstandings or lots of issues with the country government. So this effort of trying to bring these topics together to understand how the different exercises can feed each other, can work together, is extremely important. And this report makes a great job to doing this. Just in general, I would like to stress something that a few things that have been said already, but just to put them together and notably highlight the complementarities between the two exercises, the LTES and the LTLEDs. They have some commonalities, but they also have some differences, and that's been very well highlighted by Nadim in his presentation. I think that here it's very important that when we think about the synergies between the two exercises, we don't dilute the value added of each exercise. We recognize that the role of LTES is just to go deep into the energy sector and making sure that it captures as well as possible all the critical dimension of the energy side as a critical input for the reflection in the LTLEDs. On the other hand, the LTLEDs starts from the climate questions, which obviously is important in the energy sector transition, but providing this feedback from the LTLEDs to the LTES will be also very useful. So here, I think that the approach that is proposed is exactly the one that should be followed, meaning try to recognize the value of these two exercises. We are not talking about merging things. We are talking about making sure that while these processes are developed, there is a good connection and interplay that are put in place between the different processes, because these processes will rely on different tools, on different approaches, on different governance. And this is fine because they address different questions. But on the other hand, it's very important that we build bridges between these exercises. I'd like here to stress a few things on the role of scenario. That's something that has been mentioned in one of the first presentation of the day, highlighting, just to pick the word that were mentioned in the introduction, that indeed scenarios are not a crystal ball. So everything we are doing here is not to predict the future. It's to inform decisions, to reveal the consequences of different choices. And for us in the DDP, coming from the climate question, I will obviously have a bias to consider, and just again picking the classification that were proposed in one of the presentation, to talk about scenarios being backcasting. So to start from the requirement of the long-term transition, both in terms of climate change, but also in terms of socioeconomic objectives at the country level. Scenarios having a key role to play in ambition raising, and scenarios having a key role in exploring the different options. And the role being not to provide a normative answer, but really to make sure that the scenarios can provide the information that decision makers need to have in order to be able to make their decisions. So based on that, I would like to make three quick points, and again, stressing things that have been mentioned. First, the importance of capacity building in countries. Here, there is a very important aspect that we see is the need to ensure continuity of all these exercises that we are talking about. And that's true for the LTES, and that's true for the LTES. It's not a one-shot exercise. It's rather something that needs to be done over time, to also because it takes some time just for all the actors to have the full ownership of the process. And so it's very important that these exercises are not seen only as a way to produce a report or to produce an analysis, but also means to build technical capacities in the country. And here, stressing very importantly that these technical capacities should not be only in the hands of the governments. They should just really be in the hands of a broader set of actors, notably, I'm thinking about the academia, think tanks, but also civil society actors, because that's a condition to ensure the continuity. We know that governments change. And if we want to ensure continuity, we need to make sure that when people in governance change, these capacities do not get lost. So a broad approach to capacity building is critical. Second point, again, stressed in the presentation, but which for me is critical, is the question of stakeholder engagement and the participatory process. This is key to ensure both that what is done in these two exercises is relevant and capture the specificities of the country context. Each of these exercises is different in nature. It can rely on similar expertise, but it's different in nature because it needs to capture the specificities of each country. And it's critical to ensure ownership by all the set of actors, all the actors that will be eventually involved in the implementation. All the transition we are talking about, whether it's about energy transition or whether it's about more broadly the climate change related transitions, will depend on coordination of actions by the diverse set of actors. And it's only if these actors are an integral part of the process of designing the strategies that there can be sufficient ownership that will eventually allow them to be a real actor of the transition. And the third comment, which basically is building on one point that was made in Nadim's presentation regarding what each exercise can bring to the other in terms of technical content. Here, I think it's extremely important to be clear about the role of models. Models are, in terms of this quantitative tool that can be used to produce the scenarios. And just want to say, I am a modeler, so I love models. I think they are extremely useful. But I think that it's also extremely important to recognize the limitations of models. Whatever model you're using, by definition, a model is a simplification of reality. And the models will have some limits. And if we want to be able both to explore all the specificities of the question that are required, if we want to have a comprehensive vision of the transitions, we need to ensure that we are not limited by the characteristics of a given model. And for example, energy systems model are very good at analyzing energy systems, obviously, but it's been very clearly mentioned in Nadim's presentation that by definition, they will have more difficulty in capturing other aspects that are very important to the energy system, but that are not in the model. And here you can think about all the drivers of changes in the energy demand sectors. I mean, these days we are talking about a lot about, for example, energy efficiency, sobriety, and controlling energy demand. We know that there are many of these levers which relate to behaviors, for example. The energy models can have only a very simplified vision of that. And it's fine. It's perfectly fine, but it's very, very important that the analysis is not limited on this aspect and that we can find other ways to include in the analytical work all these dimensions that are required. And the last point here on this technical aspect, the second comment is, it's very important that we adopt multidisciplinary approaches. If we want to have the analysis being relevant to talk about, it's been mentioned, right, health, talking about labor, but also talking about, for example, issues like trade, obviously very critical in all the questions. We need to acknowledge that it's a combination of methods that need to be there. And if we want the analysis to address these questions, we need to bring in the design team for these scenarios, experts who can bring their expertise, bring their tools, bring their approaches, and enlarge the set of questions that can be tackled. So I think that all these points are very aligned with the diagnosis that is made in the report. So I hope that then this report can be used as a way to push the frontier of the work that are being done on energy and LTES in the countries, and provide a clear guidance for pushing this frontier and make these exercises even more useful in the future. I stop there. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you very much for your intervention. I think you said it very nicely. We need an approach that combines the whole of government, but also be inclusive in terms of engagement. We see very important in the stakeholder engagement aspect. You mentioned the modeling. Of course, we are talking about scenarios. The modeling tools are important. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So very importantly, and of course, this will, I'm sure, trigger some reflection from the audience. I'd like now to invite Malene from the Danish Energy Agency to talk about the long-term energy and climate scenarios in Denmark. Malene, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Should I? Okay, can you hear me, everyone? Thank you for inviting me. I am Malene Vested. I'm an energy advisor, engineer, and PhD at the Danish Energy Agency. I'd like to talk about the way we work with energy and climate scenarios and how we use them to build climate strategies. So let's get started. All right, okay, so this is a Climate Act year wheel. So in 2020, Denmark got a Climate Act where it was put into law that Denmark has a climate target to reduce emissions by 70% in 2030 compared to 1990 levels. And in that Climate Act, it was written that we should follow this Climate Act year wheel. So it starts in April. I've circled with a green color. And the Danish Energy Agency, that means me and my colleagues, we publish a climate status and outlook. So we say, okay, if we have the current regulations and the already put into work climate measures, where do we end up in 2035? This is the year we are working towards now. And then in September, the Ministry for Climate and Energy and Supply, it's a combined ministry, presents a climate program. So it's an update on the climate strategy. And then it's presented in the parliament approves, or they don't approve, and then the minister actually has to go back and revise the climate strategy. Then it's in February evaluated by the Climate Council, which is an independent board of 8 members with different climate expertise, and they evaluate if they believe it's a plausible plan to reach the climate goal in 2030 and in 2050 with zero emission goal. And then in April, the Danish Energy Agency again publishes an energy scenario, and then the wheel continues. So I'm really happy that Henry Weisman before said that there should be continuity in updating these climate strategies and climate scenarios, because that's exactly what's written into this climate year wheel. So it's actually written in the climate law now that the Danish Energy Agency should publish a climate and energy scenario every year. And luckily, we already did something in that regard, but it was not a complete emission outlook. So since 2008, we have published an annual report on energy and supply with a projection 10 years ahead. And then from 2014, we started to put a little bit of CO2 emission into that report as well. And then the Climate Act hit in 2020, and we had to publish a full CO2 emission outlook. And I've highlighted that with larger bubbles because it also became an extended version of what we already did. So I think the old reports were like 40, 60 pages long, and now it's more than 200 pages with all the background material. So it's a large report that we publish every year in April. And this is our main graph that I always like to present. So what you see is the CO2 emission levels from 1990 going to 2035. So everything from 2022 and onwards is a projection, and everything from 1990 to 2021 is historic data. And then I've added a dashed line representing the 70% reduction goal in 2030. So this is where we need to go. So what we do is a frozen policy projection. So if we have exactly the same regulations and laws that we have today, where do we end up in 2035? And that's, of course, completely unrealistic, because, of course, there will be changes in policy until 2035. And some might change the emission in one way, and some might change it in the other way. So this is only what will happen if we have the same trends as today and the same policy as today. And when I say trends, I mean the same behavior from people. So it's in that regard, it's a stupid model, thinking that everything in the future will be exactly like it was in history, which is the past 20 years, more or less. So what you see here is that the blue color is electricity generation and district heating, and that's been almost eliminated in the emissions from 1990 to 2025. And that's because we have closed most of the coal and gas and oil power plants and replaced them with wind energy and biomass. But what has not changed a lot since 1990 is agriculture, soil and forests, which is the bottom line of this greenish color, and transport, which is one of the top purple ones. So those are the emissions that with the current policies will not change a lot and have not changed a lot since 1990 levels. But one thing that I also want to highlight with this climate status and outlook is that we every year now see how far we are from reaching the climate goal in 2030. So in the outlook that we published in 2021, the emission gap was about 12 million tons CO2 equivalents, and the outlook that we published this year, the emission gap was around 10.2 million tons CO2 equivalents. So this is actually also a way for the politicians and everyone else to see how far are we from reaching the goal, and what's the size of the challenges we have ahead in reaching this goal. And now I want to show you how we now compare all the possible climate measures that the politicians might apply. We compare them up against this benchmark outlook. So for a specific climate measure, we can ask what's the consequence on the emissions in 2030. So first, we compute emissions from the activity under the current legislation. We already did that in the outlook, so we don't have to do it again, which is a really a good thing. And then we decide on a change that we want to explore. It could be a change in activity or emission factor. And then we compute the resulting change in emission. And this bubble graph represents different climate measures that we've analyzed in different sectors. I'm going to show you some numbers in a little while. But you see that transport, which is the pink color, and agriculture, which is the green color, they represent a lot of the possible reductions. But that's, of course, also because those are the two sectors that emit the most. So, of course, you will also see that they have a potential for reductions. I hope this graph makes sense. When we combine all these different measures, we get 43 million tons CO2, but of course, some of them are overlapping. So if we then correct it for overlapping measures, then we get around 30 million tons. And this is way more than the 10 million tons that we need in 2030 to reach the climate target. Some of the big contributions if we carried out a climate measure, I want to highlight some of these. So in the transport sector, you see there are two large emission bubbles. The bubble size represents the size of the reduction potential. So you see in transport, we can either get a big reduction in CO2 emissions by saying that from 2023, we don't sell any fossil cars in Denmark anymore. This would be an extreme, right? But this is the most we can get from that measure. It would be around 4 million tons CO2. If we instead replace all fuels with biofuel and e-fuel in road transport, we will get around 5 million tons. And the reason why there's not complete overlap is because even though we would ban all fossil cars from new cars from being sold next year, we will still have a lot of fossil cars driving around. That's why there's not a complete overlap. Then we have biochar by pyrolysis, around 2 million tons. It's a new technology that we've looked into and that we've analyzed, and that I think is a promising technology. And then extensivation of cultivated land by re-wetting drained areas. So we have a lot of soils in Denmark emitting greenhouse gases because they used to be underwater and now it's farming areas. But by re-wetting those areas, we can avoid some emissions as well. Organic farming is also almost 4 million tons CO2, and that's because organic farming has fewer animals per hectare of land, and fewer animals means less methane emissions. So that's quite a big contribution. And then carbon capture and storage in industry is also something that I pointed out here, around 3 million tons CO2. Okay, so the next one is, okay, what are the small contributions? Something that we talk a lot about, but maybe doesn't contribute as much to the CO2 emissions than we sometimes think. So in transport, again, using biofuels and e-fuels in domestic aviation inside Denmark, it might be a good idea, but it's not a big contribution to potential reductions in CO2 emissions. Using heat pumps and district heating in small businesses, not a big contribution. Planting trees, remember this is 2030. So even though we plant a lot of trees in, say, this year or next year, it won't be a big contribution to reaching the climate goal in 2030, because 2030 is only 8 years from now, and the trees only start to really obtain CO2 around 20 years after, or 15 years after they were planted. So it might still be a good idea, but it's not something that will give us the 10 million ton CO2 reduction that we need. Then we have energy efficiency, the three last ones that I've highlighted, in energy efficiency in farming, in industry, and in households. It's not a big contribution to what we can do to eliminate emissions. It doesn't mean it's not a good idea. It still is a good idea, but it's not something that will get us to the climate target. And I think this is an interesting point to make, because we talk a lot about energy savings. But there are two things I want to say about that. One thing is that it's a good idea. I think definitely it's something that's mandatory for every country to try and see where we can save energy, even though we might electrify or use better fuels. We still need to save the energy, because there's still not a complete abundance of it. And the other thing is that energy savings and energy efficiency will never get us to zero emissions, right? It will never, if we just make more efficient tools and industry and so on, and still use fossil fuel, it's not going to get us to zero. So we need to think about, is this something that will help us on the path to reach zero emissions in 2050 or 2060 or whatever the goal is for that specific country? I think that's an important mark to make. There's a lot of talk in Denmark right now about adding different additives to the food that animals are fed to make them emit less methane. And that's maybe a good idea, but it's not gonna stop a cow from being a cow. It will still emit methane. So it's not something that will reach the net zero emission target unless we obtain CO2 from other places. So I think that was my concluding remark. Oh, I have some good practices and challenges for you here. Good practices. I think this method of measuring the climate initiatives against our climate outlook. So measuring, what if we do this? What change would it give us in the comparison to a frozen policy outlook? I think that's quite a strong method. Another practice I think that I'm quite happy about is that we have one update of this per year, because now we have this outlook, and it gets a lot of attention in the public and a lot of attention from the politicians to see, okay, how far are we from reaching the climate goal now? This year it was 10 million tons CO2 from reaching the goal. Next year it might be 8 or 5, we don't know yet. And there's a lot of interest in publishing this outlook more than once a year to see, okay, now we've done this change, we've enacted this law. Can you make an update on the outlook? But we don't do that. We only update it once a year, because otherwise we would be too occupied all the time by updating this. And we already, at this point, we are maybe 30 people working during 6 months to just release this once a year. So I think this is a really good rule that we should stick to, only one update per year. And then this annual update also includes historic data, because sometimes we learn something about history. For instance, how many hectares of drained farming area do we have? Sometimes we get an update on old maps that shows us that we actually had more or less drained areas of farming than we thought. And that can also change the historic data. And it might also change sometimes the 1990 levels that we compare against. But we have to be honest with the data and update it when it's appropriate. So that might also mean sometimes to change the historic data. It doesn't change what happened in history, but it changes how we present and perceive historic emissions. Some challenges, it's related to what I just said before, ensuring a good data input, because the model result is never better than the input. So we need to make sure that we have really strong input that we believe in, and we work together with universities and other institutions also to make sure that the data input we get is correct, on as good as it gets. And then, of course, what's the uncertainty in the projection? If we say that the emission gap is 10 million ton CO2 in 2030, what's the uncertainty on that number? That's something that's really difficult to answer, and we do that right now by making different sensitivity analysis, where we try to change one factor and see how it affects the result. But overall, I personally would like to have more work on this part. Is there a different way to do it? Is there other ways we can represent uncertainties? And how do we communicate it? Because just because something has an uncertainty doesn't mean it's useless. But sometimes it can create a worry when you publish it to people that are not modeling experts, to say, okay, if there's an uncertainty, can we even trust it? Of course we can, but I think it's an important thing to communicate, especially when we talk about future, which always will be uncertain. So that was my concluding remark, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Malin, for your very excellent presentation. I like the wheel concept, very useful, and I'm sure that this can be, let's say, a good practice as well for many countries out there. I were able to capture one question online. You mentioned the challenge in uncertainties. Can you elaborate more? Because of course, is it about the estimation of the trajectory? Is it about the estimating CO2 emissions? Because yeah, this directly piqued the interest of some of our online colleagues.
Should I answer this one, or
yes,
should I
please.
come back? Okay. Can you hear me? So we have uncertainties in two categories. One is uncertainty on the method, which would also be an uncertainty even if we would report the CO2 emissions of today. And it has to do with how we get the data input. It could also be an uncertainty on emission factor. How much does one cow emit of methane, or how much does 1 liter of diesel fuel emit in CO2 equivalents? So that's one category of uncertainties, just to the method. And then the other category is uncertainty due to development in the future. So that would be uncertainty on how many kilometers is each car going to drive in 2030. That's an uncertainty on how people will behave, how temperature changes might also change the emissions from the soils. So that's a category of uncertainty on future development. So uncertainty on the method and uncertainty on development.
Thank you very much. We have other questions online. We will try to tackle them after Paul's intervention. Paul, Henry kind of introduced the fact that we need more engagement with the different stakeholders. Of course, you have a vast experience as a senior researcher in Ireland on those aspects. How this discussion with Malin made you feel about this integration of scenarios in LTES, and going forward, what should be the best practices looking at your experiences analyzing power systems?
Yeah, and thank you, Melanie. That was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. It was beautifully presented. I also learned a lot this morning. I was just, as you were talking about a cow being a cow, I was just remembering the remarks from your permanent secretary this morning, Mr. Steinberg, who mentioned Yogi Bear. When I was a kid, actually, Yogi Bear was a cartoon character in our country, but I didn't realize he was a baseball player as well. So I learned something new every day. And again, he was talking about that, referencing it to Yogi Bear was talking about the future and predicting the future. And of course, we can't predict the future, as Henry and we've all agreed on this morning, but we can understand it. And I think your presentation really showed how we can use these tools to understand the future and how we can prepare the future and maybe even create the future. And it's the tools and the techniques that you shared with us today. And thank you for sharing those best practices, because fundamentally that's what we're all here for this morning and today. It's to share those best practices, good practices, and best ideas. But the tools that we have at our disposal for these long-term energy scenarios or mission scenarios, they allow us to be proactive about the future rather than being reactive. And that's very important. You know, when we think about the future, yes, we can't predict it, but they allow us to create blueprints for the future. And that's essentially what you presented. And in many ways, we're modelers, and Henry said he's a modeler, but we're really architects of the future. You know, we can create a future that we want, and we can de-risk that future. We can present it to our communities, our families, our firms, our policymakers, and we can help them understand it. And I think what you have demonstrated here is a very powerful way of taking the tools, you know, taking these Excel spreadsheets and all these times and leap and message and Markal, which are incredibly dense, but making them living documents, making them real, making them applied, so we can look to that future, we can create it. We're not hostages to confusion or to hopelessness. We're architects, and we can use those scenarios in very, very positive and very useful ways. And I love the idea of the Climate Act year wheel. I think that's excellent. You know, one of the things we struggle with in our country, and I see a lot right across Europe and across the world, we're full of ambition, we're full of ideas, but translating that ambition to action is really challenging. But by having a review every year, you take that ambition and you kind of you make it a living document. You feed it with ideas, you feed it with urgency, you feed it with policy. It's not a document that you resuscitate every 10 years. So having that climate year wheel act is a really clever idea because it keeps us honest as providers of information, but it keeps our policymakers honest as well. When you do yearly reviews, how well are we doing? That's really important. And I think that's a really interesting best practice I think we can all take away is how do we make those, you know, these reports, Simon, as you said, how do we make them living documents, and how do we translate them from ambition into action to meet those needs? And Kamichi, this morning, one of the things I was surprised, I guess, when I was just seeing your review, is that only about a third of the roadmaps have been translated into national policy, you know. And when we think about the urgency of climate change coming out of COP, we really need to get that our ideas out of paper and onto the physical world and being translated into action. And I think, Malin, the techniques and some of the practices that you showed here, particularly that annual review, is a really, really excellent idea. The other thing I think that I took away from a best practice idea is the difference you quantified between the existing measures and the with additional measures. So we all know, you know, from a policy making perspective, there's a lot of good being done around the world, but where will those measures take us, and where is that gap? I think quantifying that gap, qualifying that gap, addressing that gap, and understanding that gap is really important, because we all, and it's very easy to get caught up in the excitement about the future and to talk about the things that we're doing today and to concentrate on the good things, but where are the weaknesses? Yes, look, we play to our strengths as a country, and you do as much as you can, but you must also acknowledge those weaknesses and work to those weaknesses and addressing it. So the idea between having scenarios where you quantify where will existing measures take you, with all the uncertainty that brings, and the honesty as well, but where will additional measures take us? And that lovely bubble graph that you show there, from a policy making perspective, that's really important, I think, because it allows policymakers to take a menu of options. And again, it's the idea you're not hostage to hopelessness. You can be proactive, and you can look at those options. And it's incredible, isn't it? You know, when you look at those options and you look at something like rewetting of peatlands or organic soils, comparing that with energy efficiency. And again, that not that conflict, but sometimes the different avenues that thinking about emissions and thinking about energy will often lead you to different policy levers. You know, and looking at the agricultural sector, looking at CCS, looking at energy. I think that was really, really good. So I would just want to commend you and thank you very much for sharing those best practices. If I can just finish on a question, because I was taking notes at the end and my pencil ran out of ink. So did I hear you mention your team? How many do you have on your team working on this analysis? Did I hear 30? You have a team of 30?
So the number of people engaged in this annual publication, I don't know the exact number actually, because we are 80 people in my department and we're more or less all involved, but not full time. So I think my guess would be 30 people or maybe 20 people full time, more or less full time.
That's a really strong takeaway for me. Our climate secretariat has 2 people full time. And I know many countries struggle around the world with capacity. And we talk about capacity, but at a political level, sometimes you have to put your money where your mouth is. You have to fund people, funding ideas. That institutional capacity is really important. 80 people is incredible. That's and it shows you, I guess, what you need, isn't it? We can have all the tools, that, but you must fund people and ideas and maintaining that capacity. So that's something I'll be bringing back to our ministerial capacity in next week. So thank you very much, Wayne. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I think you made a great introduction to the next part of this session, the interaction, both with the colleagues here today, but also online. Colleagues online, of course, you are welcome to formulate your question on the chat. There is also, I understand, a form you can submit questions, and we'll try to pick them up with the team. But maybe I'd like first to open the floor to the audience. If you have any, you have a fantastic panel at your disposal. What are the things that strikes you, and maybe ask any questions or complement information there? So please raise your hands and I will give you the floor. Yes. And thank you for being the first one to take the floor. I just remember, please speak as close as you can from your microphone for the online colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for all the presentation. I think that it was very nice. There was a lot of very useful insights for us.
Miriam, just can you introduce yourself quickly for the online people?
Yes, sorry. My name is Miriam Bueno, and I came from Spain for the Ministry of the Ecological Transition and the Demographic Challenge. So I have like a reflection and a specific question about the last presentation, specifically about how to assess the energy efficiency measures, because I mean, the effect of these kind of measures are going to be different depending on the scope that you take into account, because I mean, the direct reduction in emissions of energy efficiency measures could be very limited, but if you take into account also all the cross-cutting issues, I mean, all the energy that you need to invest for the heating or for the final end uses of energy efficiency of energy in any sector, I think that this circle is going to be higher. So I would like to know if you take into account only the direct energy consumed in final sector, or also you take into account all the transformation sector and so on. So thank you.
I can answer that immediately. The energy efficiency is only related to the direct energy use. So, for instance, if meeting energy efficiency would require something from the industry to change production, that would be assigned to the industry sector. So that would mean a change in the industry sector, not in the. For instance, if you would need to put up more wind turbines, that would maybe cause a CO2 emission somewhere, but that's assigned to a different sector. If I don't know if I understood you correctly.
Yeah, completely. So I would like to make a follow-up reflection, if it's possible. So I think that, for example, in this case, something that we need to take into account in this kind of scenarios is also this effects, because if not, you are like not taking into account all the positive effects of energy efficiency measures. So in this way, I think that sometimes from the viewpoint of long-term energy scenarios, we have to take into account the whole system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have now a question. First range.
Hi, my name is Brad Little. I'm from Natural Resources Canada. My question is to Maylene. I've found in your presentation one slide particularly interesting where it seems that the mandate of your organization suddenly broadened in scope. It seemed that you went from producing LTES, like a merged LTES, to LDES. Is that correct? And where does actually the Danish Energy Agency fit within the government?
Thank you for that question. So it's interesting with the CO2 emission part. That's under the Danish Energy Agency. So if you take an area like transport, the transport in itself is located in the Ministry of Transport, but the CO2 emission part is located in the Danish Energy Agency. Or the same with the agriculture, the emission part is located in the Energy Agency. And I think that's because we had the strongest model built up already. And I think that was a priority because exactly of this energy outlook that we published every year, that they felt the politicians placing the CO2 emission part in our ministry or in our agency. That was that. But the outlook that we publish every year, that's something that's a publication from the Danish Energy Agency, and we are placed under the Ministry of Climate, Energy and Supply. So that's a more or less independent publication. We inform the politicians beforehand, so they are aware of what's coming out, but they're not engaged in the actual development of this annual outlook. But the bubble chart that I showed you is actually it's from the annual climate program or the strategy that the government presents every year. So that's the Minister of Climate presenting that, but the Danish Energy Agency provides all the numbers. So we have a publication with the numbers, and then all the political decision making is built on top from the minister.
Yes, please go ahead, Brad.
Sorry, just to follow up then. So just within, I think, your wheel, which agency actually provides the policy advice? Would that be the independent body? I think it was at the top of the wheel? Like a recommendations on policy direction?
We don't make advices.
Sorry, who does?
That's a good question. We just provide the numbers, and the ministry asks more questions. Is there more to be done in the energy efficiency or something like that? And then we provide new numbers. But we don't advise what way to go. We don't advise you should do something about transport or you should do something about agriculture. We don't do that. We just present the numbers.
Thank you. We have a question here. Yes. Okay, colleagues. So a clarification. Yes.
Hi, my name is Mette. I'm a colleague to Malene, and I would like to supply some more information on that. So the Energy Agency supplies all of the numbers, as Malene said, and then our department puts on top of those numbers plans, which take into account economy, different financial initiatives, and then they kind of present like a menu of plans. And from these plans, the politicians will discuss options. Yeah, so we give the numbers, then plans are made, then the politicians.
Thank you for the clarification. Any other questions from the, yes, Asami?
Thank you very much. I'm Asami from IRENA. It's a follow-up question to the one that was raised before. So DEA develops outlook and you somehow communicate to the government. And I was wondering if there's any like challenges in communicating your technical results to the government officials, because that's something we've been discussing in the context of LTES. Are there any challenges and how this has been addressed?
Ooh, that's a good question. Sometimes the minister of climate is not very happy about the numbers that we find, and then that's sometimes it's not a very popular publication. But I feel that we have freedom to develop the numbers without too much interaction. And I think it helps that we have a quite complicated model, to be honest. So it's not just a spreadsheet. It's a quite complicated model, so you have to really be involved in modeling to point out. Yeah, so it helps us actually to keep the computations and the model work in house and make it trying to make it a closed process until the numbers are done. But what has been added is that every year we publish and we send it out to everyone to comment the input that we put into the model. So we publish emission factors and we publish hectares of land and all the input to the model. We publish that and everyone can participate in the hearing of those input data. And then after that, we have, that's an agreement we have with the minister and the ministry, that after we've published that and if we agreed on that, then we have the freedom to carry out the computations and the model results freely.
Thank you very much. A difficult question, Asami. I would even strengthen or increase the difficulty when you have a caretaking government. So it add to the difficulty to communicating information. Kenichi, we have a question online from Bashiru from Niger. They were very interested about the presentation and from your analysis of the current LTLEDs and the review, what will be, in your opinion, the main challenges to develop LTLEDs in a developing country or low or middle income country?
Thank you very much. And it's important questions, as I recall the comments from Ploy that first of all, we often hear the lack of data and information and expertise. So many developing countries, even or some developing countries are still developing their energy balance statistics. And it's really difficult to project the future or mid-century emission projection without the robust energy balance data. And in addition to the energy sectors, what is more challenging is collecting the data on land use, for example, the forests and agricultural lands. And even if some international organizations provided support to the developing countries to provide or collect the data at one project cycle, but as we heard from this presentation, in order to really produce meaningful projection and strategy and scenarios, they need sustainable institutional arrangements. So how to say, the lack of data and expertise, including the lack of manpower. We often hear the climate change department in developing countries, small developing countries have only, let's say, less than 10 people or 5 people, and the same people appear in the different topics of negotiation, adaptation, mitigation, energies, and yeah, that is the challenge.
Thank you, Kenichi. Henry, I was going to ask you a similar question. I see your hand raised. Please, if you can comment on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I mean, that's definitely a critical question. And I mean, what's just been said is very true. That's definitely part of the challenge. I get that there is another aspect which needs to be taken into account, that these analyses, if we want them to be truly relevant to the country, they need to capture the key specificities of the country situation. And in the case of developing countries, it means that it's not a climate change discussion. It's not an energy discussion. It's a development discussion that needs to happen. It's a development analysis, which means that what is critical, and then what is a real challenge, and it's a challenge everywhere, but specifically in the context of developing countries, is that you need to develop studies that go beyond the standard approaches of just having sectoral focuses, talking about energy, talking about emissions, but you need to start from development questions. And that's something that is, from a technical standpoint, is very challenging, because obviously it requires just to bring together a set of expertise. It's not only energy experts, it's not only climate change experts, you need development experts, and you need to make all these people work together. And that's a challenge in itself in all the contexts. But in the context of developing countries, if you don't do that, then your analysis may look nice, but it will be useless. So that's something that is critical. And here I'd like to mention one thing, which is probably a risk facing all these challenges, is that there may be a temptation to take shortcuts, meaning to notably to bring external people, consultants or of different kinds, who can come and produce a very nice study, because I mean, they're very good, they produce very nice studies. But the problem is that this study doesn't contribute to build the capacities of the country to make its own decisions. And that's a risk that we've seen with, for example, the first round of nationally determined contributions that were developed. And to some extent, it was good because they were produced, but many of them in developing countries were produced by relying on external expertise. And the problem is that, acknowledging the need for continuity in the process in the countries, if you do that, you have no guarantee that the process is continued. So a challenge in the context of developing countries is also to make sure that the capacities are being established while doing the exercise, which requires to mobilize the experts in the country, which requires to mobilize all the institutions in the countries and make sure that they are not only recipient of the study, but they are an integral part of developing the study. And that's a challenge, but that's a necessary condition to make these studies useful.
Thank you, Henry. I think you're reinforcing the need to build capacity also in countries. The outside expertise can be useful to fill some gaps, but of course, it will not be useful in the long run. Any other question from the floor? Yes, I see two. We'll start from the bottom and go back to the front.
Yes, hello, this is Melisande Liu from the Clean Energy Ministerial. I absolutely agree with what Henry just spoke about. And I wonder, based on the experience I've had in the Caribbean, where we actually had a team of 3 to 4 people, and oftentimes also those important tasks, taking shortcuts and putting this task to external consultants who then produced nice reports, but which essentially ended up being a black box because there was no real capacity building within this institution. My question is capacity building enough? Because I've seen a lot of development money also flow into capacity building workshops, but in the end, it comes down to the fact that these institutions are very weak and they're unable to pay solid wages to people and retain the talents and skilled people that are necessary to establish this continuity. So my question is, how do we work, or how do we establish this continuity with very weak government structures and institutions?
Someone wants to comment or comment? Yes, please. And Henry after.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And that's also a question that at the partnership we're trying to address as well. So many of our countries have 1, 2 to 3 colleagues that are working directly on their climate policies. I think our solution is not the end goal, but is what it aims to support this, is that we have or we deploy embedded advisors or in-country advisors to the government, to the climate team, to support the government in, coordinating the implementation of the NDCs or implementation of their climate plans. And how we would like to approach this is that the support might be deployed or supported by our partners, whether that be GIZ, UNDP, IRENA, etc. And it's more on the midterm, so 3 to 4 years, in the aim that as the in-country facilitator is there, they also build the capacity of the colleagues in country. We also understand countries have some countries have more frequent transitions of people, depending on the government as well. But this facilitator is meant to stay on and kind of fill the gap whilst capacity is being built. But the idea is that within the 3 to 4 years, when this person has finished their role, the capacity is built and retained within the country. But this support is there to kind of be a booster to the government officers in country. So this would what we see in our approach. Another part is that not only for climate, but we also have deploying embedded advisors in the Ministry of Economy, who also have a climate lens and also supports this interministerial coordination as well. So this would be what the partnerships approach is.
Thank you, Ploy. Henry, is it a legacy hand or you want to comment?
It's a new hand. I will keep it short because I don't want just to use all the time. But I mean, this question is really critical. And just I want to say that, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. There is also an aspect that is important to keep in mind when you talk about capacities is establishing capacities outside the government. I don't say that everything should be done outside the government, but on the other hand, building on using the resources that can be mobilized. And this echoes a question that's just been put in the chat that talks about national budget constraints. So there will be a lot of funding coming to support, for example, LTES or LTLEDs. It's essential that an important part of this money also goes to the other constituencies in the country. And here I'm thinking notably about academia, universities, think tanks, all these actors that can play a critical role to inform the process, to contribute to the design of the process, because capacity building, it should also be about making sure that this research institution can be stabilized, that you can hire PhDs and postdocs and train them to all these activities, because that's also a key condition and probably an even more robust approach when we think about this question of continuity. So for me, it's very important that we are on these two legs, that we support the government, but that also we acknowledge the critical role of institutions that are outside the government, but that can work very well with them and can contribute very usefully to the process. And we have lots of examples of that working very well in developing countries. So that's a model that has made its proof already.
Thank you, Henry. We had 2 questions. We had Laura, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Laura Gutierrez, and I am working with the Get Transformed program, which is a global initiative supporting power sector transformation in different developing and emerging economies. I am coordinating long-term energy planning and VRE integration activities as part of the program, and we are doing technical assistance to countries on different topics, including energy planning. And one of the things that I think the capacity building is for us, of course, one of the challenges we are trying to address with our support. I would be interested, maybe I'm going to go a little bit into the technical details, but when talking about the capacities, one of the things I'm thinking, like, we are now going back to our countries, trying to report also the highlights and the conclusions of this workshop. What are the tools, what are the modeling tools on the quantitative side of things that you think are important to develop along these capacities for this connection between LTES and LTLETs? Because I hear probably with the Danish Energy Agency, there must be a set of tools that you are interlinking to do this type of analysis. And this is also one of the challenges that we have in some of these developing countries where they have a small planning or modeling team that typically has maybe expertise in one or two modeling tools. And this is one of the key questions that maybe some of the things that you have taken from the LTES synthesis report and the exercises that you are already doing, some of the modeling tools that you think will be useful to connect the dots between these cross-sectoral analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Malin was very popular. Maybe we can ask Paul first and then Malin. Also, Paul, relating to your work on the ETSAP initiative, maybe?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. A very good question. It's as you were chatting there. Look, I think there's lots of really good tools out there, as we saw from Michi's presentation. You know, Times, Markel, Message, Leap. You know, in many ways, I think it's important to use the tool that's appropriate for the sector that you're working on. You know, if you're working in the power sector stuff, there's stuff like inertia and transience and stability and all that stuff that needs to be considered. So if those are the things that you're interested in, you need to cut your cloth to measure and use a tool that's appropriate. In many ways, Laura, I guess if I step back from it, yes, models are important, but I think modelers are more important. You can have a really strong model, you know, like Times or Markel, which is complicated and dense. But if you've a weak modeler, it doesn't help. If you're not able to extract, communicate, and convey those results, it's not very important. So in my mind, yes, the models and the softwares that we use are very important. There's lots of them out there. They must be transparent. They must be, you know, something you can share, something you can audit. But I think it's the symbiotic relationship between the person doing the modeling and rather than the software producing the results is very important, because softwares will give you results and anybody can know a result, but very few people can understand the result. And if you understand the results coming from a model, that's very important when you're communicating to your colleagues. It's very empowering, actually, for a person to have that ability. So yes, the softwares are important, but good software with a person who doesn't have the skills is just not very good. You can have a great person with a really poor software and you'll get a really good outcome. So I think both of those two things need to be considered, I think.
Thank you, Paul, very much. Malin, you have any remarks regarding this aspect?
I can add that what we use is based on times, so that's what we use, and we have a department in the Danish Energy Agency where we exchange model work and energy planning. It's called global collaboration or something like. And in that department, they use times as well. So I think that's a good place to start. And then for the agriculture and other areas, I think it's just a spreadsheet actually. Not just, but it's a complicated spreadsheet. But I think those are the basic tools that we use.
Thank you, Malin. We also had a question also on the left of Laura.
Thanks, Antena from the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. Thank you very much for the presentations and discussions. Going back to Malin's presentation, the bubbles showing the emission reduction capacities of these potentials of these different measures is really interesting, a really good overview. But do you see a risk also that policymakers would go and say, let's just expand work on electric cars and forget energy efficiency, while we know that energy efficiency has strong synergy with several other measures, including expansion of renewable energies, saving idle capacity, for example, so that you don't have to invest in that. What is your view? Do we need to add an extra analysis on synergies and trade-offs, or how do we address this? Thank you.
Yes, and we actually, that's a really good question. So you can exchange all cars with electric cars and you will still have many challenges, also noise related, pollution, not pollution related, but rush hour related, things like that. So this definitely doesn't show all the different aspects there is to choosing one path. So I think from this point, you need elaborate descriptions on each of these So if you choose electric cars, what's the what would be some of the consequences? And I think it would quite clearly show that energy efficiency is still a really good idea, and maybe even trying to put some policy measures that tries to reduce the use of private cars, things like that. We did do some calculations. They didn't come up in the final report, but we did do some calculations on what if more people work from home, what if traffic is less pronounced, and so on, and that could give quite a good reduction as well. And I think that's something that we should look more into in the next report, if we can describe that even better. But I hope I didn't make the conclusion that energy efficiency is completely unrelevant, because it is really relevant. But when we look at the specific numbers in Denmark, it's not what's going to make us reach the climate target alone. It's a range of different things. And since the two sectors that emit the most are transport and agriculture, we need to address something in those two sectors before we can reach the climate goal. But energy savings is always a good idea.
Thank you, Malene. I think we have time for one more question from the audience, if any. I see none. Difficult. I'm between you and lunch, so I will try to wrap it up. But there was a question on the, maybe for Ploy, the regarding we mentioned that there is often limited capacity, but also mentioned there is limited number of person working on those topics. What are the typical level government countries can activate to increase the attention on LTES and obtain resources to work on it?
So from our perspective, what we're seeing is that in order to leverage further support or leverage further resources, it's if a country has a clear vision on where they would like to go by 2050, if they have a clear target for the NDCs, for example. But again, that then leads to the question of what if the country is lacking the capacity to formulate this vision or formulate these targets so that it can be communicated to the international development world to mobilize the resources. I think from our perspective, this is also a need that is important for countries to address, that may need technical assistance to formulate these visions. So it's a little bit of like continuous support, and I think the international development world is ready to provide this support. I think from the partnership side, we do see countries requesting or will be requesting support to identify what their 2050 vision would be, and we have partners who are ready to support that. I think if we look more specifically at this thematic call that is being or that has been launched, there is an entire stream of support that is dedicated for preparing countries to see their long-term vision, to see what those actually entail, and to understand, perhaps similarly to what you're saying, that it's actually the agriculture and the transport that needs to have that immediate support. Not that the others are not important, they're just as important, but perhaps it is maybe placed more in the midterm. So all in all, I think the preparation and the understanding of the baseline of a country is very important in the first phases, in order to then have more concrete steps. And with the LTES, I think, and also the integration of the LTES, very similar acronyms here, it gives the country a common strategy to move forward for climate, which is covering not just energy, but other parts, but helps with the common strategy forward, and also helps with having a strong message to climate financiers as well to invest in these components. So That would be my.
Thank you, Ploy. I'd like to close the session, maybe to ask the panel if they have any final remarks, any thoughts from other intervention, other questions that were not immediately addressed. Paul, I see Paul. No. Kenichi? Okay. Yes, please go. Go ahead.
Just this is a kind of my reflection. As Henry mentioned, that we need a capacity not only inside the government, but also outside the government in the country. I also witnessed the same experts outside the government attending the UNFCCC process and providing valuable inputs to the government negotiators, because the government official comes and go the political cycles or rotation cycles. And what I wanted to stress is that yes, the number of staff in the climate change department may be limited, but in order to achieve the climate change goal, we need kind of the staff and the people who knows about the climate change issues outside the climate change secretariat or climate change agency. For example, energy ministry or energy utility companies and the business and the finances. So yeah, I just wanted to stress that we need more people who are aware of the climate change issues outside the climate change community as well.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other comments there. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending this first session. I'll ask my colleague to kind of introduce or tease you the next steps, the next session. But thank you very much for the panel today. Ploy, Malin, Paul, Kenichi, and Henry for preparing their intervention. Thank you very much for your contribution. And I now hand over to Angela, sorry, for the next step. Thank you very much.